So I would like to thank Erasmus University for this very considerable honour of this degree. And I'd also like to thank Johan Mackenbach for his extraordinarily generous introduction to me. I'm going to talk very briefly about three issues that I have worked on and that Johan has touched on. Johan discussed work on health inequalities, differences in health between social groups. And I guess I came to health inequalities, or to inequalities, early in my life. I come from a town called Warrington, which the namesake of your Rector Magnificus, Frederick Engels, in his book Conditions of the Working Class in England in 1845, described as the inevitable slag heap that had to form between Manchester and Liverpool. And things have rather little changed. In a government survey of areas of Britain, out of 152 places surveyed, Warrington was the place that came 152nd, i.e. bottom of the list of towns by quality of life and well-being. And by a completely separate survey of 325 towns by the Royal Society of Arts, Warrington was described as the town with the lowest level of culture, 325 out of 325 of all towns and areas in Britain. So inequality was something that I was naturally drawn to in my work. And we're just looking at the continuity of such differences by looking at Warrington in 1845 and then Warrington today. And using a different area-based indicator, in 1996 with the geographer Danny Dorling, we looked at mortality in Britain by voting patterns. And here on this graph, what you see is that at areas that had very high rates of voting Conservative, mortality rates were lowest. And conversely, as might be expected, areas with high rates of Labour voting, mortality rates were the highest. So the highest for Labour voting, mortality rates the lowest in the areas where there was high votes for the Conservatives. Now, you could imagine the Conservatives could have used this to say, vote Conservative and live longer. But because Danny and I in the paper, we had described how the areas where people don't need a national health service, they can send their kids to private school, they don't rely on a state pension. They don't rely on the welfare state. We're voting for the party that would systematically dismantle all of those things, which has partly went on to happen. Indeed, the Conservative Party called for the sacking of the editor of the British Medical Journal who published this paper and said that it was written by a well-known Marxist. Now that is a terrible slur. I was not then, and certainly am not now, well known. So, now looking at a graph that's rather similar to the one we saw there, but in a way sort of flipped, looking at Trump voting in the US, The Economist magazine showed that the best predictor of places that voted for Trump were places that have been screwed. And a health indicator putting together obesity, mortality rates, type 2 diabetes, heavy drinking, etc., predicted the places that voted for Trump. So other forms of social misery that emerge from the concentration of such deprivation and of such effects. But the issue is, how can one then go from these sorts of data to causation? And I think that when one's looking at individual level interventions, you need to be very certain about causation. If you're going to give advice to individuals to do particular things that relate to behavioural change, for example. And epidemiologists have a very bad name in this area in terms of being people who keep promoting new risks every day. Here's the random medical news. And from this, you can see that the news reader just presses a button and the three wheels spin round. And then today's news story is that coffee causes depression in twins. And then tomorrow there's a new risk. You can very easily see from these circles that none of these are causal, except red wine does cause sexual dysfunction in men aged 25 to 45. But it's a distant memory for me, obviously, but that is certainly a causal association. So as Johan went to mention, for looking at individual risks, I have been interested in applying a technique of Mendelian randomisation where you turn genetics on its head, if you like, because you use genetics to tell you, or to tell us, about modifiable factors, factors that can be changed by environmental change, by behavioural change, etc. Factors that can be changed to improve health. And I've got a brief video which is going to be shown now, which will explain this.
Epidemiologists are interested in understanding factors related to health and disease. Do smokers tend to die younger than non-smokers? It certainly looks that way. But disentangling cause and effect can be difficult. Smokers are different on average from non-smokers. They're more likely to drink heavily and have less healthy diets. But even if we measure these confounding factors, we may not measure them perfectly, or there may be others that we haven't measured. Also, as people become ill, they may cut down or give up smoking, which could wrongly suggest that reduced smoking leads to worse health. We could randomly assign 50,000 people to smoke and 50,000 people to not smoke and follow them up to monitor their health. This removes the possibility that any other factor could be responsible for any differences we see in their long-term health. But this is neither ethical nor practical. Fortunately, we have all been recruited into an experiment without knowing it at the point at which we were conceived. Our genes, which are passed on randomly from generation to generation, influence how much we eat, sleep, drink, smoke and more. These genetic influences are not affected by anything else you may or may not choose to do in your life. They're not related to confounding factors. We can use this knowledge to learn about cause and effect, grouping people according to their genetic code. This method is called Mendelian randomisation. For example, smokers who carry one version of a gene called CHRNA5 tend to smoke less heavily than those who carry a different version. When we group people according to which version of this gene they have, we find that the people with the version of the gene associated with heavier smoking do indeed die younger. But is the gene influencing how long we live in some other way? We don't think so. When we look at the same gene in non-smokers, there's no effect on life expectancy, so the effect must be driven by smoking. Using this method, we can show that smoking causes lung cancer, heart and respiratory disease, and many other diseases, but does not seem to influence depression or anxiety. Mendelian randomisation has already begun to tell us about factors that influence our risk of disease. Now we're using the same approach in other ways to look at several risk factors together and to look at what influences disease progression, which may help us to develop new treatments.
So this approach, as Johan says, we've also been applying to factors like education and to look at what mediates associations between education and health, the causal relationships between education and health, and how they might be contextually dependent. But the greatest honour, touching in its greatness, the honour of the degree here, was that 2 days ago, Mendelian randomisation was explained in Elle magazine, when a study that we published looking at being a morning person and the effects of morning personness on breast cancer risk was covered in Elle magazine. And so if you don't fancy reading papers on Mendelian randomisation, it can be addressed there. Now, when looking at individual risks, however, one's got to understand that for the individual, while it might be important to consider risk reduction, individual risks are very poor predictors of what happens to any particular person. I'd like to introduce you to Winnie. Winnie is here lighting a cigarette from a candle on her 100th birthday cake, where she says that she smoked for 93 years and she's certainly not quitting now. In fact, Winnie did quit about 3 years later when the Tories put the tax even higher up on cigarettes. But this brings to us that for individuals, there's a huge element of chance in which person develops a disease, while even at a group level, that can be highly predictable and can tell us how to make group level interventions. And the need to make interventions aimed at communities and at groups as opposed to always pinpointing single individuals, I think is important. So I'd like everyone here to run a thought experiment. I'm going to take two random towns, let's call one of them Bristol and one of them Rotterdam. Let's imagine that everyone in Bristol 50 years ago was made to smoke 20 cigarettes a day from adolescence on. So when you woke up, you got your packet of 20 Camel or Marlboro or whatever, and you were not allowed to go to bed until you'd smoked your 20. Whereas in Rotterdam, no one was allowed to smoke at all. So in Rotterdam, absolutely no one smoked. In Bristol, everyone smoked. And you follow up these populations for 50 years. Who has more lung cancer? Well, of course, what you'll find is that in Rotterdam, there's much lower levels of lung cancer where no one is smoking than in Bristol. But within Bristol, how does smoking relate to lung cancer risk? It doesn't. Everyone smokes exactly 20 cigarettes a day. You're doing epidemiological studies in Bristol, you can't identify smoking as being a risk factor, even though it is causing virtually all of the cases. And within Bristol, what causes one individual rather than another to get lung cancer? Probably chance is probably the major contribution, just stochastic effects, both biographical and cellular effects, just chance effects. Between Bristol and Rotterdam, as I say, virtually every case of lung cancer, the huge difference is explained by smoking. And at a population level, you could lead to very large reductions in lung cancer risk by policies that converted Bristol to Rotterdam. I like Rotterdam, but I don't want to convert Bristol to Rotterdam. But by converting Bristol to Rotterdam in relation to its hypothetical smoking rates, you could produce huge effect on population risk. So things which cause relatively small differences in absolute risk for individuals can generate very large effects on health, which is really important in terms of how we think about targeting interventions. But between individuals, chance may be a major influence on who gets disease. And I would say that chance may be a major impact on many other life outcomes at the individual level. So, another illustration of bad luck at the individual level would be cancer of bilateral organs. If you consider, for example, breast cancer, if a woman develops cancer of one breast, the other breast has been exposed to precisely the same exposures right the way through life. You couldn't do an epidemiological study where you could distinguish between the exposures to one breast and the other breast and make any sensible way of trying to investigate why that's happened. Yet the risk of a contralateral tumour, while it's raised over the risk of just a random individual in the population, is not that greatly raised. So that means that even when you match someone perfectly on their genes and perfectly on their exposures, there's differences in bilateral cancer risks, same as seen for kidney cancer and other bilateral organs. That tells us that chance must make a major contribution, these stochastic things that we could not discipline. So we've got to embrace chance, it seems to me. And by embracing chance and actually embracing this group-level explanation is actually the basis of epidemiology. My mentor, Geoffrey Rose, when talking about sick individuals and sick populations, talked about how one has to think about disease being at the population level and interventions being to shift levels of risk within populations, and that had greater potential than targeting individuals, trying to target risk to individuals when individual level risk is highly influenced by chance events. So Julian Peto, for example, said to ask why a particular individual failed to get cancer is probably as meaningless as asking why a particular uranium atom failed to decay. So what does this mean for social epidemiology? I think the same notion applies to thinking about things like intergenerational inequality, which Johan again was kind enough to mention my work in. At a group level, if you group people by social class, by levels of social advantage, there is a very large advantage for the offspring of children who come from the better off families. There's a large effect. It's rather like Rotterdam and Bristol with respect to lung cancer. But for the individuals, there is a huge amount of chance. Not all the people from better off families do really well. Not all the people from badly off families do really badly. There's a huge amount of chance. Yet one problem, of course, is that all successful people attribute success to their, to their particular qualities, to their genetic endowment, or what they received from, in that way from their parents, not from the endowments that they receive in financial ways. So I think that it's really important at a social level to actually promote the fact that chance has a huge effect for all people, including those who start from an advantaged situation. I think if parents realised that, they would actually want to have a society which provided, safety nets for all, because it might be their kids who might need such things. And I think this takes us to the philosopher John Rawls and his notion of the veil of ignorance, that we should imagine a situation where people decided how a society was organised when they didn't know about their own particular endowments. So you think, how would you like society to be organised if you didn't know whether you're going to be wealthy, be able to pass on those things to your children, or you might be not in that favourable situation? I think if people came up with the notion of societies behind that veil of ignorance, they would want a society with safety nets, a society which was helpful for all. And in fact, we are. As I say, successful people always attribute their success to their own particular abilities and endowment. It's not true. I think, I'm speaking for myself, it might be true for the other honorary doctorates here today. I was just lucky. I mean, I can think of so many just chance things that happened to me which allowed me to have an enjoyable life as an academic and to be standing on this stage today. So I think that actually conveying this, because very often things are reported in such ways that things that are actually just these individual level risks are reported as being deterministic. They're not. There's a huge role of chance, and understanding that role in everything from social mobility, through to generation of disease would actually lead to a better society. Thank you.